So here at the Western Trading Post, we get a lot of jewelry brought to us all the time. And one of the things that is very important is to figure out how to put an age or a date range on an item, because that plays a lot in the piece's value. So today we're going to talk about belt buckles. I have a few examples of belt buckles here with me. And one thing that I want to point out, some people might tell you, oh, I've got a belt buckle from the 1880s or something like that. And that would be extremely rare, exceedingly rare, because they really didn't have Western belt buckles that much until probably in the 1930s and 40s. People are saying, well, wait a minute, what about the cowboys in the Old West? Well, up until about 1920-ish, early 1920s, most blue jeans didn't even have belt loops. They wore suspenders back then. You did see some belt buckles on concho belts, like the Native Americans wore, and of course the gun belts and holsters, they had buckles on them. They were more of a ranger kind of a buckle, like this little buckle here. But you didn't see like the typical Western belt buckle that much. So after people started wearing belts, most of the buckles were more of a concho belt style, which is like this buckle here. The belt went around the bar here in the center, okay? It looped around and then come back through. So this would be an example of maybe a 1920s or 30s style of belt buckle, okay? Now, but typically in the 1930s and say 40s, people didn't wear big gaudy items. They wore small items like this belt buckle here. This belt buckle is very typical of like a 1930s belt buckle, okay? And again, it's more what they call a ranger style. Now, by the 1940s is when we start to see your typical, what we consider today a Western belt buckle, start to evolve a little bit. This is an example right here of a 1940s era belt buckle. This one happens to be copper. It's got the cowboy on the bucking horse. And if you look on the back here, you see it's a solid bar that goes across the back for the belt to attach to. All right. Now, as we go more mid-century and into the early 1960s, we would still see, something like this. The Western belt buckle is evolving. This is a Zuni style belt buckle. Again, if you look on the back here, it's got a solid bar. By the 1960s, a few belt buckles had a hinged bar on the back, but they were mostly homemade manufacture. Okay. Now, as we get into the 1970s, a major change in belt buckles happened. By the 1970s, like this belt buckle here, we had a hinged bar. This is a commercial hinged bar. Like I said, in the late 60s, you might see a few people who had a commercial or a hinged bar on the back of the belt buckle, but it wasn't really a commercial made and mass-produced item at that point. So by the 1970s, we start to see the hinged bar. That was a major evolution in the history of belt buckles. So a lot of people will say, oh, my belt buckle is from the 1930s or 40s. Well, flip it over. If it has that commercial hinged bar on the back, it's from the 1970s or later. Now, don't get me wrong, not every single belt buckle made in the 1970s or later is going to have a hinged bar on the back. So right here we have an example of a 1970s belt buckle that has a solid bar still. So there was a little bit of a transition period there where some guys were using the hinged bar, other guys were still using the solid bar. I actually have a couple of belt buckles here that are more 1980s. Again, you see one with a solid bar on the back, and this one with a commercial hinged bar on the back. So the bar doesn't necessarily date the belt buckle for sure, but it is a big aid in helping date the belt buckle. I hope. And that is today's helpful hint about dating belt buckles.